Hey, boys and girls, I hope everybody's doing okay, and I hope everyone is as excited to read chapters 5 and 6 today as I am of Because of Winn Dixie. While I'm reading, remember, I want you to use some strategies and skills. I want you to make connections to the people in the story. While I'm describing the characters, I want you to think about people that you've met in real life and see if you can connect those people. What does what the character does in the book remind you of someone in real life? Also, I want you to think about the point of view that this story is being told in, whether it's first person, second person, or third person. And then I just want you to understand the characters. Why do you think Opal or Winn Dixie or the preacher does the things in the way that they do? See if I can pull my toolbar up. Nope. Okay. All right. So before I begin reading two, I am going to quickly summarize chapters 1 through 4 since we read them last week, and you guys might not remember what those chapters, had in them. So in chapter 1, we meet Opal and we meet Winn Dixie. Opal is walking through the grocery store in her neighborhood to buy groceries for her father, and she sees a bunch of chaotic stuff happening in the grocery store. She turns the corner and she sees a dog that is terrorizing the staff in the grocery store, making the store manager cry and flail his arms around in the store, and just wreaking havoc on the grocery store. So then she says, that's my dog, I'll take him. And she says, come on, Winn Dixie, and he starts following her. In chapter 2, we learn that Winn Dixie is acting like he has met Opal before. She's walking home with Winn Dixie, and she takes Winn Dixie to her neighborhood, which is an all-adult trailer park. Opal says that she's an exception, and remember, an exception is where the rules are bent a little bit for specific people. And so she is the only kid that is really allowed in her neighborhood, and she tells Winn Dixie that he also has to act like an exception and not mess with the neighbor's dogs. In chapter 3, that's the chapter that Opal spends most of her time cleaning Winn Dixie and making sure he looks presentable because he's a scraggly dog. He looks rough. So she spends most of chapter 3 taking care of him, brushing his fur, giving him a bath. And then right in the end, she's talking to Winn Dixie. And she comes to the conclusion that maybe it's time to ask her dad about her mom. Because from what we know, Opal's mom left when she was 3 years old. But we don't know anything else. And that brings us to chapter 4. In chapter 4, Opal's father, the preacher, is telling her 10 things about her mom. All right, so let's go ahead and jump right into chapter 5. Chapter 5. When Dixie couldn't be stand to left alone, we found that out real quick. If me and the preacher went off and left him by himself in the trailer, he would pull all the cushions off the couch and all the toilet paper off the roll. So we started tying him up outside with a rope when we left. That didn't work either. When Dixie howled until Samuel, Mrs. Detweller's dog, started howling too. It was exactly the kind of noise that people in an all-adult trailer park do not like to hear. He just doesn't want to be left alone, I told the preacher. That's all. Let's take him with us. I could understand the way Winn Dixie felt. Getting left behind probably made his heart feel empty. After a while, the preacher gave in, and everywhere we went, we took Winn Dixie, even to church. The Open Arms Baptist Church of Naomi isn't a regular-looking church. The building used to be a Picket Quick store, and when you walk in the front door, the first thing you see is the Picket Quick motto. That's written on the floor in tiny red tiles that make great big letters that say pick, 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 quick, quick, quick. The preacher tried painting over those tiles, but the letters won't stay covered up, so the preacher had just given up and let them be. The other thing about Open Arms is that it is different from other churches. The other thing about the open arms that is different from other churches is there aren't any pews. A pew is like the bench that you sit on in a church. So there aren't any pews. People bring in their own folded up chairs and lawn chairs, and so sometimes it looks more like the congregation is watching a parade or sitting at a barbecue instead of being at church. This word congregation is a group of people that get together for religious purposes. It's kind of a strange church, and I thought Winn-Dixie would fit right in. But the first time we brought Winn-Dixie to the open arms, the preacher tied him outside the front door. Why didn't we bring him all the way in here? Why did we bring him all the way here just to tie him up? I asked the preacher. Because dogs don't belong in church, Opal, said the preacher. That's why. He tied Winn-Dixie to a tree and said how there was lots of shade for him and that it ought to work out real good. Well, it didn't. The service started and there was some singing and some sharing and some praying, and then the preacher started preaching. He wasn't about 2 or 3 words into his sermon when there was a terrible howl outside. The preacher tried to ignore it. Today, he said. "Arr!" said Winn-Dixie. "Please," said the preacher. "Arr!" said Winn-Dixie back. "Friends," said the preacher. "Arr!" wailed Winn-Dixie. Everyone turned their lawn chairs and folded up chairs and looked at one another. "Opal," said the preacher. "Arr!" said Winn-Dixie. "Yes, sir," I said. "Go get that dog," he yelled. "Yes, sir," I yelled back. I went outside and not wearing my glasses. I went outside and untied Winn-Dixie and brought him back inside. And he sat down beside me and smiled up at the preacher. And the preacher couldn't help it. He smiled back. Winn-Dixie had that effect on him. So the preacher started preaching again. Winn-Dixie sat there listening to it, wiggling his ears this way and that, trying to catch all the words. And everything would have been all right, except that a mouse ran across the floor. All right, I'm going to pause there. Let's make a prediction on what we think is going to happen. So she says everything would have been all right, except a mouse ran across the floor. Now, my reader brain is telling me that everything is not going to be all right anymore because she uses the word except. That is going to tell us that it caused something to happen. Our little cause and effect is there. So what do we think is going to happen? I think that Winn-Dixie's probably going to chase this mouse around the church. And the preacher's going to get mad. What's a prediction that you might have? Please pause this video and tell someone the prediction that you are going to have. That what you think is going to happen next. All right, welcome back. Let's continue reading. The open arms had mice. They were there from when it was a Picket Quick, and there was lots of good things to eat in the building. And when the Picket Quick became the Open Arms Baptist Church of Naomi, the mice stayed around to eat all the leftover crumbs from the potluck suppers. The preacher kept on saying he was going to have to do something about them, but he never did, because the truth is, he couldn't stand the thought of hurting anything, even a mouse. Well, when Dixie saw that mouse, and he was up and after him, one minute everything was quiet and serious, and the preacher was going on and on and on. The next minute, Winn-Dixie looked like a furry bullet shooting across the building, chasing that mouse. He was barking and his feet were skidding all over the polished Picket Quick floor, and the people were clapping and hollering and pointing. They really went wild when Winn-Dixie actually caught the mouse. I've never in my life seen a dog catch a mouse," said Mrs. Nordley. She was sitting next to me. "He's a special dog," I told her. "I imagine so," she said back. Winn-Dixie stood up there in front of the whole church, wagging his tail, and was holding the mouse real careful in his mouth, holding on to him tight, but not squishing him. "I believe that mutt has got some retriever in him," somebody said behind me. "That's a hunting dog." So he calls him a mutt. A mutt is just a mixed breed dog. Winn-Dixie took the mouse over to the preacher and dropped it at his feet. And when the mouse tried to get away, Winn-Dixie put his paw right on the mouse's tail. Then he smiled up at the preacher. He showed him all his teeth. The preacher looked down at the mouse. He looked at Winn-Dixie. He looked at me. He rubbed his nose. It got real quiet in the picket quake. "Let us pray," the preacher finally said, "for this mouse." And everyone started laughing and clapping. The preacher picked up the mouse by the tail, walked and threw it out the front door of the picket quake, and everybody applauded again. Then he came back and we all prayed together. I prayed for my mama. I told God how much she would have enjoyed hearing the story of Winn-Dixie catching that mouse. It would have made her laugh. I asked God if maybe I could be the one to tell her that story someday. And then I talked to God about how I was lonely in Naomi because I didn't know that many kids, only the ones from church, and there weren't many kids at the open arms. Just Dunlap and Stevie Dewberry, two brothers who weren't twins but looked like they were, and Amanda Wilkinson, whose face was always pinched up like she was smelling something real bad, and Sweetie Pie Thomas, who was only 5 years old and still mostly a baby. And still mostly a baby. And none of them wanted to be my friend anyway, because they probably thought I'd tell on them to the preacher for every little thing they did wrong, and then they would get into trouble with God and their parents. So I told God I was lonely, even having Winn-Dixie. And finally I prayed for the mouse, like the preacher suggested. I prayed that he didn't get hurt when he went flying out the door of the Open Arms Baptist Church of Naomi. I prayed that he landed on a nice, soft patch of grass. All right, so before we move on to chapter 6, I want you to think about how you would feel if you were sitting there minding your own business, maybe in class or at home, and a mouse just ran across the floor. Now, I'm not scared of mice, but mice do creep me out. So I believe that I would even probably freak out a little bit if I was sitting there minding my business and a mouse ran across the floor. All right, let's continue to chapter 6. Chapter 6. I spent a lot of time that summer at the Herman W. Block Memorial Library. The Herman W. Block Memorial Library sounds like a big fancy place, but it's not. It's just a little old house full of books, and Miss Franny Blocks is in charge of them all. She's a very small, very old woman with short gray hair, and she was the first friend I made in Naomi. It all started with Winn-Dixie not liking it when I went into the library because he couldn't go inside too. But I showed him how he could stand on his hind legs and look in the window and see me selecting my books. And he was okay, as long as he could see me. But the thing was, the first time Miss Franny Block saw Winn-Dixie standing up on his hind legs like that, looking through the window, she didn't think he was a dog. She thought he was a bear. This is what happened. I was picking out my books and kind of humming to myself. And all of a sudden there was this loud, scary scream. I went running up to the front of the library, and there was Miss Franny Block sitting on the floor behind her desk. "Miss Franny," I said, "are you all right?" "A bear," she said. "A bear?" I asked. "Has he come back?" she said. "He has," I asked. "Where is he?" "Out there," she said with a raised finger and pointed at Winn-Dixie standing up on his hind legs, looking through the window for me. "Miss Franny Block," I said, "that's not a bear, that's a dog. That's my dog, Winn-Dixie." "Are you positive?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," I told her. "I'm positive. He's my dog. I would know him anywhere." Miss Franny sat there trembling and shaking. "Come on," I said. "Let me help you up. It's okay." I stuck my hand out and Miss Franny took hold of it, and I pulled her up off the floor. She didn't weigh hardly anything at all. Once she was standing on her feet, she started acting all embarrassed, saying how much I must think she was a silly old lady mistaking a dog for a bear, and that she had a bad experience with a bear coming into the Herman W. Block Memorial Library, a very long time ago, and she never had quite gotten over it. When did that happen? I asked. Well, said Miss Franny, it's a very long story. That's okay, I told her. I'm like my mama in that I'd like to be told stories, but for you to start tell excuse me, but before you start telling it, can Winn Dixie come in and listen too? He gets lonely without me. Well, I don't know, said Miss Franny. Dogs aren't allowed in the Herman W. Block Memorial Library. He'll be good, I told her. He's a dog who goes to church. And before she could say yes or no, I went outside and got Winn Dixie. And he came in and lay with a humph and a sigh right at Miss Franny's feet. She looked down at him and said, he most certainly is a large dog. Yes, ma'am, I told her. He has a large heart, too. Well, Miss Franny said. She bent over and gave Winn Dixie a pat on the head, and Winn Dixie wagged his tail back and forth. She snuffled around her little old lady feet. Let me get a chair and sit down so I can tell the story properly. All right. So that is all that we are going to read about today. But what you can do is you can make a prediction. What kind of stuff do you think she's going to tell us in her story? All right. I hope to hear from you guys tomorrow. Have a good day. Bye.